Hello and welcome to this patron exclusive Sonic Cinema podcast quick take. My name is Brian Scuttle of Sonic Cinema, and thank you for being a patron. This quick take, sort of quick take, was inspired after the Oscars and watching some of the commentary I would see on Twitter in particular about Shape of Water winning over Get Out and what makes a classic, what movies are going to be remembered, how Shape of Water wasn't necessarily going to be remembered, but Get Out would be. And it got me thinking about a topic that I've thought about often over the years, and it's one that I think is very apropos for that conversation. And that's the idea of what constitutes a classic in modern cinema. It's a conversation I think is always interesting to have, and I think because of the fact that film is such a subjective art form, it's something that it's going to be different to everybody. What movies are considered classics and what movies aren't. The interesting thing is, I feel like since the years in the past 20, 30 years, 40 years even, with the advent of blockbuster cinema after Star Wars, Jaws, and all of those films, I think the idea of what constitutes a classic has somewhat shifted. You have so many films, because think about the classics in the golden age of cinema. Think about the 30s, 40s. You have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, The Big Heat, Maltese Falcon, Citizen Kane, Rear Window, Vertigo, Psycho, 2001: A Space Odyssey. All of these are what I would, and many, many others, are what I would consider established classics, which is to say, even if you haven't necessarily seen them, you kind of consider them as classics within the realm of cinema. One of the things that has occurred to me over the years that I feel like we've gone away from the notion of established classics, this notion of classics for everybody, and you have a lot of niche classics. Now, it's interesting to think of Star Wars and Jaws in this respect, because on the one hand, they're movies that most people can identify as great movies or classic movies, but at the same time, especially with Star Wars and the original trilogy, they also fill a particular niche in pop culture, which not necessarily everybody has an affinity for. And I think something about, the more I think about it, the more I think something happened after Star Wars, when the 70s and 80s, the 70s gave way to the 80s, and you started to see more and more movies where they're classic films, they're enjoyable films, but a subset of people consider them classics, whereas other people don't. They don't really have the same weight with everybody the same way Casablanca does, or The Maltese Falcon, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or Gone with the Wind. It's almost as if movies are more niche oriented in terms of who they're made for. Now, that being said, I do think there are movies akin to the Casablancas and Citizen Kanes that have come out over the years that would be considered classics. I think Goodfellas is definitely one. I think Pulp Fiction, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan. And Pulp Fiction is an interesting one, but the fact of the matter is, I do think it qualifies for that. Shawshank Redemption, certainly. I think The Sixth Sense is in that category. But then you get to movies like Fight Club and Lord of the Rings and even for me, Cloud Atlas, where I feel like the audience for those movies starts to shrink. Even though I know a lot of people who love those movies, I do think that while they're great films, and I think they're films that sustain the test of time, they don't necessarily have the same weight for everybody the same way that a Casablanca or Goodfellas or Saving Private Ryan does. They certainly don't. They're more ambitious, they're more adventurous, and it's I feel like we're starting to see we've over the past 20 years, we've started to see a shift in the idea of what a classic film is. And you can't necessarily define it quite by the same binary thinking that you could in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where, oh, well, it's Humphrey Bogart, it's Alfred Hitchcock, it's Orson Welles, it's Michael Curtiz or Frank Capra. It's not necessarily the same thing anymore. And so that's something I think when you're talking about Shape of Water versus Get Out, I think they're both excellent films. I think most of the films that came out this year and that were nominated for Best Films were excellent films. Get Out was my personal pick for Best Picture, and I think it's going to sustain as a great classic, especially when it comes to racially charged filmmaking and discussions on race in America, the same way Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing is. But at the same time, I definitely see The Shape of Water being something that really continues to resonate with people over the years in the same way that Cloud Atlas does for me, and Pan's Labyrinth, another Guillermo del Toro film, does for other people. And so that's just something that I had in mind. It's an idea that I've bounced around my head for a little bit, but it was after the Oscars that I really started to think about it a little bit more and realize that this is something that is definitely, and there are so many shifts in cinema culture and the way we think about cinema, the way we talk about cinema. And I think this is another one. The idea that classics are for the masses, I feel like, is gone. Or the fact that you can dictate what's going to be a classic for one reason or another, I think is gone. And I think that you're going to see now more films, more variety of classics come out of this era of filmmaking that don't necessarily reach the masses in the same way those great films like Shawshank and Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan do. But at the same time, I think they're movies that mean something to the particular audience that's watching them. I mean, I think Dark City is one. I think Cloud Atlas is one. I think you look at Adaptation, the Spike Jonze, Charlie Kaufman movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Brokeback Mountain, although I think that is going to be seen as a legitimate classic in the same vein as Shawshank and Goodfellas over the years. It's that great of a film. But it's one of these things that I feel like we need to, as film fans and people interested in cinema, to really wrap our heads around the fact that the idea of what makes a great movie compared to what doesn't is shifting dramatically as the years go on, as the medium evolves, as the medium changes. And I think that's exciting. I think it's interesting that we're starting to see, on the one hand, it's a good thing because of the fact that more films, I think, are going to be in that realm of, more variety of films are going to be in that realm of, oh, this is a great classic of cinema. But at the same time, it's not good because of the fact that you start to see a tribalism when it comes to specific films. And you see it in specifically genre. And that's something that I think film fans in general need to think about in a very profound way when it comes to movies and what makes a classic compared to what doesn't make a classic. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, Shape of Water being Get Out is not going to be a discussion worth having. It's just going to be because, everybody feels like one movie should have won over the other. And yes, I'm somebody who felt Get Out should have won over Shape of Water too, but I also feel like Mother, which was my pick for the best movie of 2017, should have been nominated for anything. But at the same time, I'm not going to criticize the Academy for picking a pretty audacious fantasy from Guillermo del Toro, Best Picture of the Year, when this amazing study on race and racial issues from Jordan Peele went home with just a screenplay nomination. They both won something, and they're both going to endure. And I think that's all that really is important. I think that's the most important thing about this. And so that's all I had for now. Thank you very much for contributing. Thank you very much for being a part of this. I really am looking forward to the things that I'm going to share with you in the future. I've got more about my book coming up. I've got more podcasts. I've got more older film commentaries to share with you. I've got more musical ideas to share with you. And thank you very much for contributing and subscribing to the Sonic Cinema Patreon. If you haven't already, it's at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. And this is Brian Scuttle. Thank you very much.